Good morning. It's a real honor and privilege to be here with you. Back in 1997, or I'm sorry, before I start with that, I wanted to share something that the way that Paul started several of his epistles. He started off, "Every time I think of you, I thank my God, because you guys have been with us in so many ways, and we want to thank you for your support." Back in 97, my wife and I and our two little girls were invited to go overseas to the Alliance Academy. And our youngest was 2 years old, and your church adopted our 2-year-old daughter. Now she's in college. She's sitting over here. It's Megan. And you guys have been with us through that whole time, supporting, encouraging. We knew you were praying for us when we were there for 2 different coups where they toppled the president. You were with us when the volcano erupted 7 miles from our house. You were with us in all the different things that happened, whether it was earthquakes, whether it was political unrest, even different transitions that we went through where we saw God's hand in things. It was because we knew you were praying for us and you were right there with us. And so we want to thank you for that. At this point, we're actually in the middle of a totally different transition in our lives, though. We're in the transitioning back from the mission field. And so Ellen's going to come and share with you about that. And she's a very gifted speaker. And so I know you're going to appreciate that she just shares her heart with you and tells you the things that we've been, where we've seen God's work, some things where we've struggled. But through it all, we know God's with us, and we really appreciate how you guys have supported us all the way through that. So let me turn it over to my wife, Ellen.
As Billy said, it really is just an amazing privilege to be here with you. I want to just share a little bit about my personal journey and what led us to go to Ecuador in the first place. You see, it really goes back to my grandparents, and probably before then. But my grandparents lived in Pennsylvania, and they were one of the founding members of the Acmatonia Alliance Church. And my dad grew up in that church and developed a heart for missions. My mother grew up in New York in a Methodist church, but never heard the gospel. It was invited to a youth event at a Christian and Missionary Alliance church, and she came to know Christ there. Both of my parents were called to study missions at Nyack College in New York, and that's where they met. But interestingly enough, my dad did not feel called to the mission point in his life. And so my mom kind of surrendered to her dream of being a missionary, but Mom and Dad were so active in every church that we were a part of. They were among the founding members of the Tapan Alliance Church in New York, just a tiny church at the time, and that's where I came to know God. And I came to know the Lord as a very small child, and I heard his voice. And I have no doubt that I heard his voice. And I had no doubt that God is real, and that this great God I had loved in Sunday school was also personal God and loved me. And the more that I grew to understand that, and the more that I experienced God, even as a child, in a personal way, I knew that I couldn't keep that to myself. That other people needed to know how cool God is, how amazing he is, how personal he is, how life is better with him. Not necessarily easier, but definitely better. And so that was kind of my journey to Ecuador. It was the beginnings of my journey to Ecuador. As a teenager, by then we had moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we were involved in Bible quizzing, and we did a lot of quizzing with the Alabama churches. And so I remember at a youth rally in Birmingham, Alabama, when I was about 13 years old, again, I heard the voice of God and just said, I just want you to commit and be intentional in your journey. and just commit to following me, wherever that might look. Well, growing up in a Christian and Missionary Alliance church, we were the ones that always had the missionaries in our home. They stayed and they had dinner, they spent the night, and so I got to hear amazing of missionaries who lived in the jungles of Africa and Indonesia, and it just sounded all very exciting in bringing the gospel to people who had never heard of Christ. So by then, I was in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we, all the kids from that church went to Toccoa Falls College. It's an honor to see Dr. Alford here today, because just waves of memories come back from that time period of really, for the first time, getting to experience a Christian education. I grew up in public schools, and so to be at a Christian college was just a period of incredible spirit in my life. And that's where my husband and I met. He was also called to missions. We both went to Toccoa Falls with the intention that we would not date anybody who was not called to missions because of the experience that my parents had. And we people as well. And so, long story short, we got married while we were in college, but we also got to meet a lot of these kids, our peers, that grew up in these places called missionary kids school or schools for missionaries kids. And that kind of focused our direction on what missions would look like for us. I had always envisioned being part of a church planning team in the jungle somewhere, and that was my vision of missions. But then God began to change that vision as we began to interact with all these college students up around the world in these amazing places called schools for missionary kids. And a lot of the students there at that time were from the Alliance Academy in Quito, Ecuador. And so our hearts began to be drawn there. And as we prepared, that was the place that God was going to bring us. And so as Billy shared, in 1997, we made that journey. And as in the months leading up to that, this church was a very integral part of it in adopting our daughter, Megan. When we first came and visited, this sanctuary didn't exist over there, and a few people, and some of you are still here, Marie, and a few others that were part of that original group and praying for us and sending us on and getting us to the mission field. And it really was a dream come true for us. We felt 100% that that's what he wanted us. But he had to work in our hearts a little bit because we weren't really in the jungle. We were in the middle of a city of almost 3 million people now. And we weren't church planning, but we were growing the church for sure. At first, the Alliance Academy, 29 for missionary children, needing the group of missionaries that started the work in Ecuador and in South America just needed a place for their children to come to get a quality United States style education. And that was the founding of the Alliance Academy. But something that God intentionally was that some missionaries had to leave the field because of their special needs of their children. Some children struggle academically and have very specific needs that could not be addressed at that time at the Alliance Academy. So those in leadership at that time decided that wasn't acceptable, that they needed to start a program that would meet the needs of all children so that missionary kids and missionary families would not have to leave just because of that reason. And so we started a special education program decades ago at the Alliance Academy. Well, fast forward to about 4 years ago, and we shared with you at that time, I think, that we didn't know if the Alliance Academy would be able to continue the next year because of the change in the government and their new education laws. And one of the education laws that they passed, every school had to be under the authority of the Ecuadorian Ministry of Education, and the Alliance Academy had not had to have that scrutiny up until that point. We were able to operate independently as a U.S. identity, and that was a big change and threatening. Another threat No schools could teach anything about political agendas or religion. And here we are at a Christian school. Fortunately, there are enough Catholic schools in the country of Ecuador that they didn't really know how to deal with the Christian or the faith-based schools. And so God, the other thing they said was that you could not charge for special education services, and that all schools needed to start to become inclusive. Because in Ecuador, as in many third world countries, special education students can't be serviced. They really have no hope of a life. They are the ones that you see or just they're just a real burden to their families. And so the Ecuadorian government had really good intentions with trying to force schools to become more inclusive, but we were already there. And anyway, and the spotlight really was on the in the country, because it's a very, very socialist government right now, and trying to equalize everything and trying to make all schools available to all students. We really had the spotlight on us, as did all of the international schools in the area. And it came to a real, going on trying to meet all the demands of the government, and they were closing schools left and right. They closed over 200 schools. The government of Ecuador closed over 200 schools in the country. 14 universities, including a Christian university, were closed by the government. We did not know if we would survive that. And that's, we were coming home praying that God would intervene. And you know, he did. He intervened in many ways, but it was very specific in that when I guess I should have said this before, but backing up a little bit, one, I think, or two, the Christian and Missionary Alliance made the decision that they would not continue to be the owners of the Alliance Academy. And at that time, there was a chance that the school was going to close unless somebody took over. And anyway, we were able to form our own independent education and continue the school. And through that process, we tried to be able to offer an Ecuadorian diploma, because we were getting more and more Ecuadorian students. We wanted them to be able to graduate with an Ecuadorian diploma and a U.S. diploma, so they would have their choice of where they could go to university. But, and so we worked really hard. Just did not work out. We were definitely a square peg trying to fit in their round hole. And they gave us this written agreement back then saying that we did not have to be under their authority, that we could be independent. So can you see what, like 5 years after that, when the government changed and they said all schools, well, we had this document saying that they gave us permission not to be under their authority. So that's one thing that happened, is we had this document, which they have honored to this day. Even over the change of the different ministers of education, they've honored that. They've also seen our quality program for special education campus, and they recognize that what we do well. And they also recognize that our school is not exclusive. It's not just for the upper class Ecuadorians. We have a very international community. I love seeing the flags around the church, because it reminds me, and it gives us a taste of what heaven will be like. But it does also remind me of the children that God has sent to the Alliance Academy. Because even though when we went in 1997, the school was more than 60% missionary kids, times have changed. And as the missionary community has changed around the world, we've had a whole different set of students at the Alliance Academy. We have businessmen that bring their families from around the world, and embassy and oil companies, and just people seeking to learn English. We really have become a true mission school. To now, 80%, more than 80% of the students at the Alliance Academy are second language learners, or third or fourth language. English is not their first language. And many of them are not from Christian homes. But they come, and because they've also just heard that we have this reputation of good morals and accepting people. We have a lot of Asian students at the Alliance Academy. This is a new, not new, but an exciting part of what's happening, I believe, in the days. We were contacted by folks in China saying, we would like to send students to your school and fill your dorms. Our dorms pretty much had closed because we didn't have missionaries needing that service anymore. But we were contacted by saying, if you tell us what kind of students you want, we will fill your dorms. So that's kind of the process that they're in right now. They said, if you want them to be Christian, we'll find Christian kids. Or if you want them to know English or at a certain level, we'll find those kind of kids. But in the reality is, since we've been there have been Asian kids coming to the Alliance Academy. Some of them came through the ministry of HUJB, which is now known as Reach Beyond World Radio, because they had a ministry into Japan. And so they had JB, which their property adjoins ours. And so they heard about the Alliance Academy through there. And so we had a lot of Japanese students that would come because of that. But then there was also this outreach, interesting outreach into China, and people wanting to leave China to have a life. And Ecuador, Asians are not really well respected. They're seen as taking jobs away from Ecuadorians and hurting Ecuadorian business. But at our school, they're treated well. They're treated with respect. They're treated with the love of God is what they're treated with. And so we've begun to from everywhere, Taiwan and China and South Korea, just all over. But now we're on this cusp of being able to use our dorm facilities to house a lot of Chinese students. And whatever their reason for coming, we know God's reason for sending them. And that is to introduce them to this God who loves them, who's a personal God that wants to be part of every moment of every day of their lives. And that was the joy of our ministry there. Everything we did was very intentional. When we first started, Billy was the band. And he would take kids on missions trips around Ecuador, letting them see that they could use their talent to the glory of God. They would play in little villages, and people would see all these instruments, which are not typical there, and be drawn to this free be presented, and they would build up over the weekend and then say, okay, we're going to be at this church, and they'd invite everybody to come to the church, and they'd play again, and the gospel would be presented again. One time when they went, it was such a big crowd that the church was full, and there were just 3 rows high listening in, and just showing students that God uses everything in their lives to be a testimony to him, to show his glory, as we sang. And then just every day in the classroom, in Bible classes, in chapel productions, in chapel programs. And last time we were here, I shared about a young lady whose name was Ji. Ji Myung was a Korean student from South Korea, and when she came to our school, she was actually one of Megan's classmates. She came and from a home that was just a mess. There was abuse. She had been incredibly abused. Alcohol played a big part in that. And she really struggled academically. And there were many times we did not think she was going to be able to stay at the Alliance Academy because of some academic probation. And she was in our house a lot because we helped tutor her and just kind of mentored her along. But during that journey, Ji Myung became a Christian. She totally surrendered her life to Christ and sought to Crown College, which is another CMA school, where she's studying to be a teacher. She's in her junior year, and it's her desire to go back to the Alliance Academy and be a teacher there at some point or somewhere around the world. And before, I think, part of my struggle is, was I a real missionary? As a kindergarten teacher, I wasn't one of those missionaries out in the jungle planting churches. But God revealed to me over and over again that everything that we do is for him. walk out of these doors and you share the love of Christ with your waitress at the restaurant. That's missionary work. You know, and God showed me that. After 14 years in the classroom, God led me into an administrative position as the curriculum coordinator there. More involved in some after-school activities. And one of those activities that I was involved in was drama with the high school. And I saw this as a real way to build relationships with young people and point them to Christ. We didn't always, but you know what? God's truth is everywhere. All truth is God's truth. And it was amazing through the production process of rehearsals and devotional times together, how God would reveal himself. I remember we did a play, it was Puss in Boots. Scene where the cat turns everybody into puppets, marionette puppets, and he makes them dance around, has total control of them. Do you know what that led to, that silly thing? It led to a discussion of who God is. Why does God allow bad about them? Why doesn't he force us to make good decisions that wouldn't have consequences? And other people too. And we looked at that scene of the marionette puppets and how that magic cat had total control. Is that? Absolutely not. And that was just one example. This past year, we had a new student at our school. His name is Dale, and he's Ecuadorian, but he grew up in Canada. And when he first came to our school, I didn't really know him. A little chip on his shoulder. He was at that time, I think, a freshman maybe in high school, and he didn't really want to be back in Ecuador. I think he really enjoyed Canada. Anyway, God very specifically brought him to our school. I don't believe his family is a Christian family, but I don't know for sure. And he is very talented and lots of fun, enthusiastic. But boy, every time we would pray or have a devotional time or talk about God in any form, this gigantic wall, almost visible wall, would come up. And this relaxed, fun-loving kid would, and you could just see he did not want to have anything to do with that. And the other directors and I just started praying for Dale, that God would just bring that wall down and reveal himself to Dale and let him understand Christianity, that the truth would just shine through and he would see that. Well, I got to direct Dale in 3 or 4 different plays. And through that time, sure enough, slowly, very slowly, he began to soften. And I around before our performance and we were praying, Dale prayed for the first time. And I don't know if he accepted Christ before we left, but his heart is definitely ready. The soil is definitely ready in his heart. So, but why are we back? And this is the hard part, I think, for me to share. And ladies, if you were there the other day, I had my Kleenex ready. At the Alliance Academy, we just had the joy not only of pouring into our students and their families, but also in part very much a hub of a lot of missions community people. And so you're going to hear from Joan Ewan. She's a very good friend of ours that worked at the Alliance Academy as well. And I had the privilege of going into the women's prison with her a couple different times and partnering ministry. We've gone to the city dump with Extreme Response and ministered to the people who live there. We've worked with Pan de Vida in a soup kitchen type thing. And we've had a lot of opportunity just to join in, both with our students, with our children, with our family. And it's just been a real joy, a privilege, an honor to serve in that way. Not without stresses, and we have definitely shared those with you over the years, haven't we? All the different things that Billy mentioned, from Just the stress of living in a different country, not knowing the language super well, being part of the culture but not really part of the culture. Obviously, our gringo faces stand out in a crowd. And so there's a lot of stress and strain to living there. But there over the years. And about a year ago, maybe more, we began to sense this very funny thing happening, that God was calling us back to the United States, asking us to leave and come back. But we didn't really know why, and I definitely fought it because it was just a good place for us to be. It was a privilege. And so for many months, we were busy in ministry. It was easy to kind of push it aside and not listen to the Lord's voice. God speaks to us every day. And one time, I remember very clearly, I was walking up a hill to... I always pray when I walk. In Quito, there's so much traffic, it's easier to walk than it is to drive most of the time. And so those were really great times when I would walk to the store just to have conversations with God. And I very clearly heard him say to my heart, it's almost... I really, for a while, I was like, what end, God? What end? Are we talking apocalypse, or are we, what's going to happen? At that time, things were still a little bit shaky with the Ecuadorian government and our school, and I thought, well, maybe our school's going to close. I don't know. But no, that it was time for us to come home. But I still fought God. My husband, I think, came to that conclusion much earlier than I did, maybe a year earlier, don't really know. And I kept saying, yeah, but Jimmy's only got 2 more years. We could make it 2 more years and he could graduate from the Alliance Academy. We talked about our daughters. Michelle and Megan went with us to Ecuador when they were 2 and 4. Life experience has been in Ecuador at the Alliance Academy. And, it was my heart's desire for him to graduate from there. Anyway, over the past several months, just a lot of wrestling with God, a lot of questioning. To be honest with you, God had to use some of his 2x4s to really get my attention, even though he had already very clearly told me, that it was time to go, that the end was coming up. Sometimes we are a little bit slow as humans, aren't we? We saw the Red Sea part. They saw these amazing miracles of God, and yet they built a calf and worshiped the calf. And we think, oh, those crazy people, how could they do that? But God does that with us. We do that to God all the time, don't we? And then we walk out the door, and 2 weeks later, we're like, oh, God, where are you? Or what's going on? Or, and I think this is part of our experience as humans, and it draws us back to our knees. But anyway, it was coming to a head. Some of the and I spoke honestly with the ladies a few weeks ago, and one of those very clearly was finances. When the CMA left, pulled out of Ecuador, then we came on furlough and we went back independently and under total support, and many of you were part of that. Just trusting God month to month, year to year, to supply all our needs, and he did. And that's a little bit expensive, and life became more challenging and difficult in our finances, and I think that really came to a head. God just revealing to us in the past couple of years that we were not in and that could not be solved staying overseas. And so I think that was a part of it, but not the biggest part of it, for sure. And then as our parents enter their 70s, they're not old, but troubling them, and we just really felt a heart's desire to be back in the States to minister to our parents and to do what we could to help them because they've been so supportive of us. Just really other little circumstances, God getting our attention, saying, trust me, listen to me. Going to Ecuador wasn't as difficult as leaving Ecuador was, because I think God had used so many years to Toccoa Falls to prepare us for this life journey, this adventure, this kingdom building in Ecuador. But coming home is a whole different story. And so I wrestled with God, and this is what he did. One Sunday, I think it was in February last year, we have the privilege of attending an international church there in Quito, Ecuador, called English Fellowship Church. And that morning we were very excited because Dr. Ron Klein, so inspirational. He was key in HEGB World Radio, if you're familiar with that, and just really good friends. I had taught his grandchildren, and very excited to hear him and his wife speak, but at the same time, God was speaking to me. Oh, just surrender. And I had this whole argument with God in that church service, and I was really kind of bummed because I really wanted to hear what Dr. Klein was going to say, because he's just an amazing speaker. But God finally got through to me at the closing song of that. The worship team sing Because He Lives. And I hadn't heard that song in decades. You know, that was a song of the 70s, right? Bill Gaither. And I love the song. And he began to speak to my heart. And I'm going to just read the lyrics to you. Face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. And that's where God nailed me. He said, all of your arguments about leaving Ecuador, as righteous and holy as they sound, are really based in fear. He holds the future, and life is worth the living just because He lives. So I managed to kind of get through singing that verse and going, okay, God, I'm getting it, I'm understanding, I'm hearing you. Then he really nailed me by the time we got to the second verse. With God were probably my biggest fears. You know, Mom, those of you who are mothers and fathers, you understand that everything in your heart centers sometimes around your children. And as I said, it was really my heart's desire that Jimmy could and I just had seen so much amazing growth in him. He had some struggles in middle school, just middle school, and then friends, good friends leaving, and I was just really excited about mentors that God had put in his life through some of his teachers and other staff at the Alliance Academy, some good friends that he had brought to his life. And so I was just really arguing with God about basically my fears for my son. And sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives, but greater still the calm assurance. This child can face uncertain days because he lives. And that was it. Said for the rest of the service. And I just surrendered. I said, okay, I surrender, God. I understand that my last fear for my son is pointless. He's your child. You have a plan for him. us, it would probably be most difficult for him. Man, what I witnessed in him in the years and the months following that decision, as we all wrestled through this change, was great peace. That we were all going to be okay. It was a difficult months as we began to let our colleagues know that we would be leaving. We were those people who were never supposed to leave. Till retirement or the grave. And so we had taken on many roles at the school, probably too many roles. And, I think God knew that we needed rest. We needed impact, along with some other key people at the school last year. You can continue to pray for them as they continue to fill the holes, the gaps that we left, and that the ministry continues to go forward as it will. 18 years in a place that you've learned to love has become our second home, our family, our community. And we knew that God was saying it's time to leave. And we surrendered and we said, okay, God. We would move from this ministry to that ministry. And it hasn't happened that way. And God, in his humor, I think, has moved us to a place called Jupiter, Florida. And it couldn't be more different than Ecuador and everything that we're used to. My husband grew up in Florida, and we lived here for 2 years before we went to Ecuador. So we're familiar with Florida. We're this with the ladies. The best way I know how to explain it is, how many of you ever been on a boat, like for more than a day? Okay, so when you get on the boat at first, it's kind of like, oh, this is weird, and maybe your stomach gets upset. To shore, and you don't think when you get off the boat that you're going to have any problem, because after all, the shore, the land is what your body's used to, what you're used to, and you're just going to go on with life as normal. But what happens is, because your brain is still sloshing around, and so you start walking, and it's like this, oh, I got to get my land legs now, and then it starts to feel normal. And then you lay down in your bed at night, and then you're sloshing again. And then they just kind of hit you, and you don't really expect them. Well, this is our experience coming back into the U.S. culture. We should know how to live here, right? We're Americans, after all. But there are times when everything does seem. My son is attending school there, and I've had opportunity to do some substituting and help out in their offices. But then all of a sudden, and I can't put my finger on it, what it is, but it's not normal. Just trust me. I have a purpose for you here, and I don't know what that purpose is yet necessarily, but I do know God has told me as a mom, as a daughter, as a wife, that my focus is my family. It is. Not that we didn't focus on our family when we were in Ecuador, but this is the period that we're in. A verse that he continually. I knew I wouldn't be able to quote it. It's in Matthew 11. Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And not just give you. not so good at this. We're, type A, very driven, complete the task personalities. And God has to show us how to rest. He does. And so this is what he's been doing. He's been middle schoolers and working with technology at Jupiter Christian has not had as much rest as I have, but we still have rest from living in a different culture and the stresses of some of those scenarios that we mentioned. And that God has been doing in my heart has been teaching me contentedness, being content. And this is what he did about 2-3 years ago. We had 4:13. We can all say it, right? I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth me, right? Gives me strength. I loved that verse as a missionary. There were a lot of things that I could not do in my own strength. And so my own, but I could certainly do it through his strength and the Holy Spirit empowerment. This chapel speaker pointed out to me, that's not what that verse is about. You got to read the whole chapter. The chapter is about he's talking about rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. You know that verse. I kind of get hung up. I try and read through my Bible every year. Well, I kind of gave up in a year. Because I get hung up in verses and sections that I just start thinking about, and I can't let go until the Holy Spirit gives me clarity or helps me to understand it better. And then I decided I would read, every time I finished reading through it, did the NIV version. And right now, interestingly enough, I'm in the Message, which is a very modern version. But it just gives a different insight sometimes that way. And so what God has been So I'm reading in other parts of the Bible as well, but he's really showing me that verse at the end of Philippians is based on everything that comes before it. And God has shown me that in verse 4 where it talks about rejoice in the God every day. Meditate on who he is and the awesomeness of who he is. And sometimes that boggles my mind because that makes it seem like God is so big and so far away. And then he reminds me that he knows my name. And as you go through Philippians, and I'm running out of time, but I do just want to say that this is what God is teaching me. In verse 5, do not be anxious about anything, right? But through prayer and supplication, pray, peace, guard your heart through thanksgiving, meditating on the things that God has given you. I love Thanksgiving. It is one of my absolute favorite times of year because it forces us all to whole section starting in verse 8 where it talks about think on these things, whatever things are good and righteous and just. We allow the world to push so many messages into our heads. And not be anxious and rest. So that's our journey. We've come kind of full circle from the time, I think, maybe even before, when my grandparents started. Our children being able to grow up in that amazing place. To you adopting Megan and us introducing you to her as a 2-year-old. This past summer, she had the opportunity to go to Uruguay. Kate Carpenter's daughter and son-in-law, and the Tobbies, Mark Tobby and Cora, who used to be a Redding, with an English camp there. So Megan's had the opportunity to experience. She's going to Mexico to the CMA missionaries are having their annual conference, and she is joining Kate and Tim Carpenter in a team that will focus on childcare and studying at Southeastern University. She's studying English and international relation. I can never say it right. Intercultural studies, sorry. And next year, missions full circle. God is good. God is good. Our son and our other daughter love the Lord. They're following him. What more could we ask? Contentedness. God is teaching. Hard way. But, great is thy faithfulness. I love that song. So now my prayer, and I ask you to pray this with us, is that God would give us a vision for what's next. We're okay with this period of. Is there something next? And if there is, we pray that God would just be our vision and show us what's supposed to